One. Okay. Dr. Avi Loeb, welcome to Laugh and Learn with Vern. Thank you so much for being here. How are you?
Thank you for having me.
I wanted to start with an excerpt from your upcoming book, Extraterrestrial. And this was a quote about your wife. You said, this was in reference to there was a second object that came into our universe that was unknown, but different principles from Oumuamua.
Oumuamua, yes.
Oumuamua. Okay. Here's the quote. If anything, it did the opposite by underscoring how special Oumuamua truly was. When I met my wife and realized how special she was, I married her. The many people I have encountered since then do not take away from her unique qualities. They only add to my sense of wonder at how rare she is. You talk about your wife and how amazing she is in the book a few times. You talk about your kids. You're glowing already. What makes your wife so special?
Well, that's subjective, and but she keeps me down to earth, so to speak, and we have a very good relationship where we complement each other. The reason I brought this up is because the very first object that was discovered from outside the solar system looked nothing like anything we have seen before, or the comets or asteroids, the rocks that we have seen within the solar system. But the second object that was discovered looked just like a comet. And so there was this question of whether, if the first object was so weird and unusual, whether it says something that the second object was naturally produced just like a comet. And that was my answer to this question. But in general, I think one of the most important decisions you have in life is selecting who you live with, because that affects your quality of life for many, many years.
I want to get into what you were back to, like the second object when it came in the universe. Actually, going back to first when Oumuamua came in, what was it like when was there like a moment when you're looking through the information and all of a sudden you realized this was completely different?
Yeah, so this object was the first one that we discovered in the vicinity of the Earth that came from outside the solar system, and presumably from another star or somewhere else. And at first, people assumed it must be just like the rocks that we have seen before from within the solar system, like an asteroid or a comet. But then it exhibited strange properties. It didn't look like a comet because it didn't have a cometary tail. And yet, it exhibited an extra push away from the sun, as you get in the case of comets, from the gases that evaporate from them. And so the question was, what was it? What is it? If it's not a comet, but it's behaving as if it's being pushed by something, what is this thing that is pushing it? And moreover, it had a very extreme geometry. It was, as it was spinning around, the amount of sunlight that was reflected from it changed by a factor of 10. So, and that basically tells us that it's at least 10 times longer than it is wide, because as it is spinning around, the area projected on the sky of the object that reflects sunlight was changing by a factor of 10. And so
what pushes it? So when I read the book, I was kind of confused. How does that work? Like for like even the Starship example, like I know you talk about like shooting having this laser push the Starship, or whether it be Oumuamua, like how does an object in space get to that kind of speed?
Yeah, so the explanation that we suggested was that it may be the sunlight that is pushing on it, that in fact it just reflects sunlight. That's the only other force that I could think of if it has no cometary tail. And in order for that to be effective, the object had to be very thin, sort of like a sail on a boat that is being pushed by the wind. And nature doesn't make very thin structures like that. So that implied that perhaps it's artificially made. Since we wrote that paper, there were various attempts of people to explain the unusual properties of Oumuamua. from a natural origin, and all of them contemplated, things that we've never seen before. For example, there was a suggestion that it's a dust bunny, collection of dust particles, a cloud of dust that is also pushed by reflecting sunlight. And it has to be roughly the size of a football field and very rarefied, 100 times less dense than air. And I found that to be unlikely because such a cloud of dust would not survive the journey. Dust particles are very loosely bound. And then there was another suggestion that maybe a hydrogen iceberg, just a piece of frozen hydrogen, so that when it evaporates, we can't see the vapor, the hydrogen, because it's transparent. So it acts just like a comet, it gets evaporated, but we don't see it. The problem with that suggestion is that it won't survive the journey. Hydrogen is very easy to evaporate from the starlight that comes onto the surface of such an object, and we calculated that it cannot really survive. So all the suggestions that were made in the literature did not make more sense to me than the possibility that it's a light sail, that it's just a very thin object that is reflecting sunlight and is being pushed. And I should say that just a few months ago, in September 2020, there was another object that didn't show a cometary tail and showed evidence for a push by reflecting sunlight. And then that object turned out to be a rocket booster from a 1966 mission, lunar lander that was called the Surveyor 2. And then we just discovered, with the same telescope, Pan-STARRS, we discovered this object moving in an orbit not far from that of the Earth, and exhibiting this extra push because it's a hollow structure, very thin structure. And in that case, we know that it's artificially made because we made it. In the case of Oumuamua, we know that it couldn't have been made by us because it was flying much too fast. It was not bound to the sun, and spent only a few months near the Earth, not even coming close to us. So obviously it was not human made.
When you talk in the book about, when you started to look through the data and how you said, I believe the quote, something along the lines of like, was it physics is a conversation with nature?
Right, it's a dialogue with nature, yes.
A dialogue with nature. What do you do when, like, so you have all these other explanations that it seems like people want to have. Why do you think it's so hard for other scientists to also look at data and come to the conclusion that it could be made by someone else or something else?
Well, there is a taboo on discussing the possibility of other civilizations because, the scientists recognize the literature that there is on science fiction that is quite large, and it's not scientifically based. This is fiction, science fiction.
Do you actually watch science fiction movies?
I don't enjoy science fiction because very often the storyline violates the laws of physics. So I have a problem enjoying it when I recognize that it cannot be realized. It just
you can't turn it off for just like a little bit.
No, I cannot, because for me science is a way of life. You see, when anything I think about in life, I think through the lens of a scientist. And if there is a problem in the pipe, or any issue, like for example, I'm jogging every morning now. After the pandemic started, I'm staying at home, and every morning at 5 a.m. I go to the local woods, and I notice those branches that are lying on the ground, and then I immediately estimate whether the number of such branches makes sense from the number of trees that you have, and then how long do they survive on the ground before termites eat them. So that this is just the way that the physicists think about anything in reality. So you're confronted with some evidence or some information and try to understand it, the context. So that's how I don't think of science as my job. I think of it as a way of life, so to speak. And that's why I also don't think that science is an occupation of the elite. If you explain it clearly enough, I think anyone can understand what the scientist is doing. It's just like a detective story, And in the case of Oumuamua, there were all these anomalies that didn't make sense, didn't line up with what we expect for a rock, for a comet or an asteroid. And so I just decided to put on the table the possibility that it's not naturally made. Just like going to the beach, and most of the time you see rocks or seashells that are naturally produced, but every now and then you see a plastic bottle, and that tells you that there must be a civilization in the neighborhood.
When your book was very easy for me to follow.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering how I know you said in the book, like I've written, leave it 700 papers, 6 books, I think, including this one. But your writing style it's conversational.
Right.
How did you learn to do that? Because I've read a lot of scientific reports just from growing up. It's not like what you did. That's not, it's the book is for anyone. It's not just for scientists.
Well, first of all, I enjoy, and I think in a way that is just like the common person. I don't think of myself as any different than anyone that practices common sense, and I don't try to explain things that I don't understand myself. So it comes completely natural to me that, once I understand something, I can explain it clearly in simple terms, and there is no issue here. But also, from teaching, I learned how to explain things to students, and I had a lot of communications with the general public over the years about my scientific work. But I think the most important thing is, as a kid, I really enjoyed the literature and the philosophy books, and now I'm writing almost every week or 2 weeks. I write a commentary to Scientific American, and I've been doing it. I've written since the pandemic started about 10 months ago. I've written of over 50 such commentaries, so almost every week. And so I by now I learned the craft of explaining things in a better way.
What do you think, generally speaking, scientists like yourself or others can do to continue to it feels like right now there's a big disconnect, and I think you hit on this in the book, that there seems like there's like this, and I think the pandemic kind of has exacerbated it, where there's like the idea of like there's science where there's this process, and then there's like science, don't question it. And I feel like how do you maybe see that public dialogue going, and how do you think it can be improved? Because it feels like there's just this is how it is sometimes, and this is how you have to deal with it, but that's not how science is. I don't know if I'm
No. So the nature of science is a work in progress, and most of the time we don't know for sure what's going on, so there are different interpretations, different explanations to the limited data that we have. And the scientific community prefers not to communicate anything to the public at that point. And the claim is that the public will not believe us if we talk about global warming, and at the same time we say that on many other fronts we are unsure what's going on, then we will not gain the confidence of the public. And I think that's wrong, because in fact, if we are transparent and we reveal the scientific process the way it goes, so when you don't have enough evidence, you are unsure, there are competing explanations, and then as you get more and more evidence, you get more confident at the conclusions, then people will view it as a detective story that they can really understand. And it's a much better approach than closing off in a room and coming out only when you know for sure what the answer is, because otherwise, it looks as if you are preaching to the public, as if you are standing on a pedestal, and it creates this alienation of the public, thinking that science is an occupation of the elite. I don't think of it that way. I think of it as a way of life, as dealing with the limited information, and we should be sincere about it. The emperor has no clothes. We shouldn't really pretend that we know what we are talking about all the time. Most of the time we don't know what we are talking about. We are trying to figure it out, and we are trying to get us more and more evidence, more and more data that will guide us.
You talk about that, you mentioned in the book too, let's say an extraterrestrial civilization and us come in contact, like, shouldn't we have a baseline understanding of certain things where we have confidence? And I like what you said about the scientific method being a way of life. You can't see it, and I'm not going to flip it around because I just moved into a new apartment, and I got there's just stuff everywhere. Okay. And for a lot of my friends, they know I'm a little bit of it's a stereotype, the mad scientist. There's like, I have my papers everywhere, but I know where the pile is. You're not like that. I mean, your place looks fantastic. So
No.
I'm assuming it always looks like that. But
Well, actually, my desk is always organized because I cannot think if things are in disarray, you know. And so I guess I'm not a typical scientist, but I really don't care, you know. I'm trying to keep my eyes on the ball, you know, which is the evidence, and I'm not trying to get the largest number of likes on Twitter. That doesn't bother me at all. I don't have any social media presence. My wife asked me when we got married not to have any account on social media, and I agreed because it gives me the freedom of thinking independently and not wasting a lot of time on other people liking me. And overall, I am doing it because I want to understand the world, and it's not about creating an image of myself so that other people give me awards or honors. That's not really the goal for what I'm doing.
do you think that, even though you told your wife you're not going to do it, do you think that in general, there's would be a way for you to use some of these newer technologies like that to get your messages out? I mean, obviously this is a podcast. You've been on other ones.
Mm-hmm.
For example, there's a new app called, let me know if you've heard of it, Clubhouse. Have you heard of that
No,
one?
I haven't heard. Mm-hmm.
Clubhouse it's like Twitter, but it's all audio conversations. People will set up, and they'll set up private rooms. So for example, a couple of days ago, there were a few mayors, I think it was San Francisco, Los Angeles, and Miami, and they were talking about different technological solutions for the future. So I'm wondering, like, what do you think could make sense from a standpoint of, you don't want to be on social media because you don't want to have that, I guess, that profile. You want to be focused on your work, but also that's kind of the way a lot of people get their messaging out these days.
Well, that's a good point. I agree with you. So there are two things that one can worry about. One is producing the message in a reliable way and getting the right message. And the second is to get it across. And until recently, I just focused on getting the right message. But you're right that if I want to convey to a large audience, I would need some presence or someone that would communicate it for me. You know, will create these paths of communication. So, but the issue is really, if you have too much friction with other people through social media, then you start to resemble everyone. And sort of like, these seashells that are rubbing against each other on the ocean floor, and eventually they become indistinguishable grains of sand. So if you keep rubbing against other people all the time, you become indistinguishable from them. To keep your independent thoughts, you have to separate yourself at some level. But I agree with you that you still need to communicate what you're doing. And for that, the social media is very valuable. Yes.
You find, or how do you work with younger scientists or fellows or other students you teach? Because they've got to be grappling with that, because on the one hand, they're with you, they're learning so much, and then they go in the lab or wherever, but then they still have this wonderful / evil device in their pocket. And
Right.
it's, so how do you work with them? Just kind of what you mentioned now, like how you maybe stand out by not doing that?
Well, before the pandemic, obviously, we would base all of our interactions on personal meetings, but now it's Zoom, and they are using a lot of social media. I should mention an anecdote that in my class, I asked my students what would happen if there was a spaceship landing on campus and asking you to get on board. Would you do it? And all of them said yes, which was not surprising to me, but the thing that was surprising is that they said they would do that under the condition that they can share their experience through social media with their friends. That was surprising to me, because if I were to go on such a trip that is so fascinating, I wouldn't care less about whether other people are sharing it with me. If I would go to climb the Himalayas, I would just do it for the challenge, to challenge myself, to enjoy the environment. I wouldn't care whether my friends see the same things as I do. It's not about bragging. It's about me enjoying the experience.
Where do you think that comes from? I know in the book you talk about I think it was in first grade, you paused. You had that moment of pause, and then you kind of got accolades for it, but in your head you said, well, I didn't really do anything. Where does that independence streak come from?
Well, it's just that I'm thinking about anything that I do. Okay, so like I was interviewed on Joe Rogan the other day, and before the podcast, he offered me a drink that I decided not to take because I just drink water and I don't want any other substance that is different that could affect my brain in any possible way. And it's just the way I am. I think about anything that I do. I don't take unnecessary risks, especially regarding my body. I'm operating on a relatively cheap fuel, which is water, and a carb-free diet. But the point is that I'm trying to keep as healthy as possible. Exercising and eating quality food and not too much of it. And I don't compromise this, and I think about everything I do. So that started as a kid, as you mentioned. When I came to my first day in class, I saw all the kids jumping up and down on the tables, and I was thinking to myself, does it make any sense to do that? And while I was thinking, if I were to convince myself, yes, it's a lot of fun to do that, then I would jump myself. But it took me some time to figure it out, and I was saying, why are they doing it? And then the teacher came in and said, look at Avi, he's so well behaved. And I wanted to correct her because I wasn't well behaved. It's just that I was trying to figure out if it makes sense to do that. And most people just do things without thinking about them, just for the fun of it. I'm just wired differently, I guess.
I would have been trying to get people to jump on the desks with me. So you have this very the way you think. In the book you talk about how you have these great ideas in the shower, right? In the shower ideas,
right?
And then you have a drawer where you keep them, right?
Right. No, actually, the reason the ideas come to me in the shower is mostly because I'm not interrupted there. Now with the pandemic, I'm staying at home. I'm not interrupted as much, and I get ideas also not in the shower. But when things were as usual, then I would get them in the shower. And it's funny because one day I had a television crew from the Netherlands that came to visit my home to interview me about some of my ideas. And I told them that I get my best ideas in the shower. And then they said, well, we have to film your shower. It's very significant. And I said, you don't need to film my shower because there was a previous tenant of this house. Yeah. And he never wrote a paper in astrophysics. He used the same shower. The shower has no significance. It's just that I have more time for myself when I go to the. They said, no, we insist. So they went with their TV cameras and took images of the shower.
Was your wife? What was going? Like, did your wife know what's going on? Like, at least in my family, there's usually like my mom or dad's like, "Hey, we got to clean for like 3 hours before anyone goes in the living room, let alone your private bathroom." Was there like a moment where it's like, "Hey, you can film it, but like we need like 30 minutes just to like look it over"?
I don't really care, where the soap is, and but it was strange to me that they actually considered the shower itself as significant. And in terms of my drawer, that's where I keep my notes. And it's just ideas that pop up. Usually they bubble up during the day, and sometimes I don't have time to work on them. So I just write them down and put them in that drawer. And the thing about ideas is that they come to me all the time. Maybe at some age, it will stop coming, and then I'll go into politics or do something else. But at this point, it's just I feel responsible for writing them down and doing something with them. So either writing a scientific paper, writing a commentary for Scientific American. They just through my experiences all the time, there are ideas coming up, and they bubble up. It's not because I get paid to do what I do. Many professors, after a while, once they get tenured, they just stop their creative work. They teach, mentor students, go home and enjoy life. But for me, the fact that I'm hired as a tenured professor is not really the thing. I'm interested in what I'm doing, not because I'm getting paid for it. I would do it anyway if I have my food and my time, I would do it anyway. So if I were put, for example, in prison, that would not be very confining for me because I can still come up with my ideas and write them down.
You just need paper.
Sorry?
You would just need paper and pen.
Exactly. And also when I do routine stuff, then I come up with ideas about science. For example, we had a flood in the basement at some point, and I had to bring a plumber to figure out what's going on. And we found that there were tree roots that were blocking the sewer. And that led me, after a few hours of working with the guy down at the basement, it led me to think, oh, actually, indeed, the water, when it goes down the pipe, has to go somewhere. It has to go to a reservoir in the city somewhere. And that inspired me to think about what happens to matter that falls into a black hole. It must collect somewhere. Where does it go when it goes to the singularity in the middle? Does it collect into an object like the reservoir, the city reservoir? Or does it go to another universe or somewhere? So I wrote a Scientific American essay discussing this unsolved problem as of yet with respect to black holes. So the fact of just working on the sewer and solving that problem connects in my mind to a black hole. There is no difference. I mean, science is a way of life for me.
What is a day in your life like right now? I mean, you talk about, you have all these ideas, you work on a few ideas, you teach, you're a dedicated family man. What are some of the routines that you have that help you stay I mean, you talked about earlier though, you work out, you eat very well. What are some other things, or what's like a day in your life like?
Well, the day is meeting with people and also writing most of the time, except the last couple of weeks were quite different in the sense that my book is about to come out. So
yes,
I had
Extraterrestrial for everyone.
Extraterrestrial, and I had about of the order of 5 to 6 interviews every day that fill up my day and take away time from my creative work. But it's quite remarkable the level of the intensity at which these interviews come in. And I see that as an opportunity to communicate my messages. And therefore, it's quite helpful because other people are listening. For example, I had a podcast with Lex Friedman that within 5 days got 500,000 views. And it was 3 hours long. So also the one with Joe Rogan a couple of days later was received a lot of attention. And altogether, I got, for example, 7 communications from filmmakers and producers in Hollywood just over the past week, interested in my book and perhaps making a film out of it. And I told my literary agent that if a film ever comes out of it, I want Brad Pitt to play my role.
Okay, so that actually answered my question. Who would be playing you in the movie? Well, yeah, because you tie it in. You do a nice job of you tie it into your life story, and you have these very relatable. You talk about you fix the tree branch, and healing that tree branch, and how the little simple thing can make such a big difference. I have a couple.
I should say that tree branch is a metaphor to helping young people when they are quite, their career is fragile and they need help. So this branch on the tree was broken, and I was advised to cut it off, but I put an insulation band around it, and now it's the tallest branch in that tree. And to me, it's an important metaphor, and I look at it every day because it reminds me how important it is to support people early on in their life.
I have a couple. I know we're on a time crunch. I figure talk maybe another 5 or 10 minutes, and then I'll end it. I just want to say a couple words, and then I know you got to go.
Good. Go ahead.
I have to ask the obvious question: what is it like working with Stephen Hawking?
I didn't actually collaborate with him, but the story started in 2015 when actually it started even earlier. When I was in my 20s, I attended a conference where I had to carry him up the stairs because there was no elevator there. And he was very lightweight, roughly the weight of a kid, you know. And that was my first encounter with him. But then in 2015, I attended an event in London at the Royal Society with him. I stood up in the hallway, and his caretaker said, Professor Loeb, would you mind speaking with Stephen? He's very bored. Nobody is speaking with him right now. So I went over and I said, Stephen, we are about to inaugurate the only center in the world that focuses on the study of black holes. We call it the Black Hole Initiative at Harvard next year, and we would be delighted if you were to come for the inauguration and give the keynote speech. And I left it at that because it took him a few minutes to respond, and I wasn't that patient. And I didn't expect much, but then a few months later, a colleague of mine came to my office and said, you know, an amazing thing happened. Stephen Hawking asked his doctor to come over for the inauguration of the Black Hole Initiative, and that will be his first trip across the Atlantic in 3 years. The previous time was a visit to the White House. And the amazing thing is the doctor agreed to do for this visit, for this trip. The only problem is that you need a medical aircraft that would cost, so that the trip would cost about $500,000. And at that point, my colleague looked at me and said, but you are the director, so that's your problem to find this money. So
That's not you.
I immediately called the dean at Harvard and asked, is there any way we can charge tickets for a performance, for a talk? And the dean said, no way, we cannot be responsible for his health, and so forth, and just said, forget about it, told me. But then to meet with a wealthy individual that I managed to convince to contribute the amount necessary. And then Stephen Hawking came to visit us and then participate in the inauguration, as well as in the announcement of the Breakthrough Starshot initiative to visit the nearest star, and with a spacecraft during our lifetime. So that was a project that we initiated around the same time. And he came over to my home in near Boston, and for Passover dinner, and it was quite a scene because there was the entire entourage, that also some police and or people, security people, who were very helpful, because one of the guests brought wine that and when she put it on the floor, it broke, the bottle broke, and then the security people were extremely quick in bringing napkins to clean it up. So altogether he enjoyed the food, you know, and he was even though he could not move much physically, he enjoyed life, and I admire that about him, because a typical person would be depressed given his physical limitations, but he lived life to the fullest that he could, and was very optimistic and forward-looking. And I think that's an inspiration for many of us to not be depressed by circumstances that sometimes are not really accommodating what we want. And look at Stephen Hawking, you know, that's the most extreme constraint that you can have on a person, and he lived a very happy life.
Well, I know during the pandemic, a lot of people have had there's a lot of mental health issues, but one of the reasons I started this podcast a few months ago, and there's no chance I would have ever met you if we weren't all kind of stuck. So I feel very blessed. I mean, obviously everyone that's had bad situations, that's not okay. Like, I mean, but like, I'm trying to take advantage of the fact that, like, while I'm here and while I can't go out and do things, that I can, you know, taking a chance to
right.
meet you.
So there are benefits. You can always look at the full part of the glass rather than, yeah. And one thing we should always appreciate is, you know, we live a short amount of time, and we should enjoy every moment of it rather than agonize about things that we lost. And one thing that astronomy teaches you is a better perspective, a sense of modesty. We should not be driven by our egos, and we should be modest and thankful for what we have, and happy about it.
Dr. Loeb, Dr. Avi, I should say. I think that's a great way to get us out of here. Your book comes out, if I want to call, on the 26th, Extraterrestrial, and I'm sure everyone will be able to get that on Amazon or any local bookseller. Where else can they find you if they are interested? I know not Twitter. Where else?
No,
where else
they
can they? Yeah.
They can just put my name on Google and they would get to my website, which actually has a lot of information about what I do.
Avi, thank you so much for coming on Laugh and Learn to Laugh. I can't even say it. Actually, I got it. Last question I got to ask you. If you were, I know you got time constraints. I could literally go on for hours. I love all this stuff. If you were the head of what'd you call it? Looking for dead civilizations. It would be the
archaeology, space archaeology. Yeah.
Yeah. If you could, how would you design a program in 1 minute? How would you do it?
Right. So I would look for different signatures of other civilizations that may not be alive anymore. For example, if they polluted the atmospheres of planets, we can find these pollutants even after they're gone, and we can look for burned up surfaces from a nuclear war. We can find, for example, satellites, a swarm of satellites surrounding a planet on which there is no life anymore. We can find megastructures, or we can find artificial lights that are still on the night side of a planet that reflects that there used to be people living there, but they're not around anymore. Or the easiest thing is to find a message in a bottle, just relics, that space junk, equipment or stuff that they left behind floating in space. And perhaps Oumuamua was one of them.
That's about as good as you could tie that into everything. It's like you've done this before. All right.
No, I didn't do it before. It was the first. I'm improvising. It's a jazz concert. That's the way you should look at it.
If someone listens to this and think we put on a verbal jazz concert, I would be floored. Dr. Loeb, thank you. Thank you so much for your time
tonight. It's a pleasure speaking with you, Eric. Thank you.